Hello, Internet! Once again, it is time for me to do my part for the tourism industry in the United States of America by informing every one of you of where you should take your car and go see the sights that you might not have seen before this. And, not much else to say. You know what this is about, so without much further ado, I present you yet another 5 places in America that you must see before you die. Enjoy. In the small Florida coast town of St. Augustine, a very interesting and beautiful city or town that I will definitely get back to in its own separate video, lies the Fountain of Youth Archaeological Park. This is officially the place where the explorer Ponce de Leon first made landfall in the Florida area and therefore became the first, again, official white man on the American continent instead of just the Caribbean islands. Today, most people think that the actual first landfall took place somewhat to the south of St. Augustine, but what is definitely certain is that the first Christian missionary station on the North American continent was placed in St. Augustine, and the picture you see now is actually a remnant of the original stone cross that was put up there at the time in the very early 1500s. So what was De Leon doing there except for general exploring? Well, he was looking for the Fountain of Youth, because the local Indians down at the Caribbean islands knew quite well by now how to lure the Spaniards away from their territory, so they told stories about this magnificent golden city with friendly natives who would help and give their gold freely to any who came along, and who had access to this amazing water spring that granted them perfect health and nearly eternal life. And, well, naturally, De Leon swallowed the bait and moved with his ship towards the area that the natives had pointed him towards, and eventually he arrived at the St. Augustine area. And sure enough, he thought he had found what he was looking for. He had found a tribe of Indians that were, according to historical records, about 180 centimeters in height on average, lived to around 80 years old. Basically, they were like modern day Westerners. The thing is, the Spaniards were not. They lived to somewhere between 40 and 60 at most, and De Leon himself was known as a giant amongst men, the tallest man in his command. He was just over 5 feet. So when he discovered this tribe, he was obviously certain that the particular spring they got their water from was in fact the mysterious and legendary Fountain of Youth that everyone has sought for years. So yeah, he set up his missionary station, he set up his stuff, and he started looking for all the gold. There was no gold, and eventually De Leon sailed back to the Caribbean and continued his career in that area. However, the Spanish did settle around St. Augustine, and it did become one of their more important settlements and fortresses in the Florida area, and today everyone can visit the park and get a taste of the magnificent, health-bringing, immortalizing water that they found there. You can see other stuff at the park, of course. There is the Fountain of Youth itself. You can get however much you like to drink from it. I have had multiple cups from time to time, as has the Daddy Sage, and this will, of course, in both our cases, mean that we should look forward to a very, very long and prosperous sagey career. I will have to warn you, though, that the water does have a fairly sulfuric smell and a bit of a taste, but it's not actually all that bad when you come down to it. The fountain itself, though it is, of course, the main attraction, is not the only thing to see in the area. There is some museum buildings. There are a small planetarium where they show various movies about the Spaniards' trips to the New World and the local Indian legends and so on. The ground itself is actually very pretty, with big, pretty lawns and a view out over the Atlantic Ocean. And the rebuilt buildings around the missionary station, the peacocks walking around to liven up the area, and as you see in the current picture, the daily firing, or actually hourly firing, of a cannon out across the marshes in the area. Very interesting, especially when it's being fired at the same time a speedboat is passing by. When you are done with that, you can go to the local gift shop and buy multitudes of, from interesting to tacky merchandise, just like anywhere else. You can also buy bottled water from the actual Fountain of Youth, so that you can bring it home to people you would like to have with you in eternity, or, just someone you want to annoy by telling them they're looking old and they should really drink this water. Overall, Fountain of Youth Park is definitely worth a visit for anyone with an interest in either history or just, fun areas to visit. Mystic Seaport in Connecticut, on the banks of the Mystic River where it flows into the Atlantic, is the largest maritime museum in the United States. It holds a very, very large amount of ships and various buildings that explores the construction of old wooden ships and the general history of the Mystic Seaport, which has been a major fishing and shipping town for centuries at this point. There are, as you can imagine, a multitude of ships in the harbor museum area, and I shall dwell only briefly with two of them, one being the former Georg Stage, which was a Danish cadet ship or a Danish training ship where young people were granted the basic training in seamanship before either continuing on to the fleet or to other educational purposes. Another one, which also has its origins in Denmark, is an old supply ship that used to sail, supplies to the beacon ships we used, which was basically ships equipped as miniature lighthouses that you could then place out on the actual ocean in order to control shipping lanes and so on. This particular ship, Gerda II, was also used during the Second World War as one of the smaller vessels that many Danes used to smuggle the country's Jewish population to Sweden when the Germans were going to arrest all of them and send them to various concentration and death camps in the Greater German Empire. Beyond the ships, of which you can go on to and visit the greatest amount, there is, like I said, various buildings you can enter, like old forges and shipwrights and so on. Also in the museum, it's possible to actually get sort of sailing training and instructions. You can hire ships to take you out on actual sailing trips, and there are usually also various concert possibilities and often a bunch of fairly interesting sea shanties being sung as work songs by the volunteer and museum staff that works in the area. So, you can get something for almost anything. Overall, if you have any kind of interest in sailing or sailing history or ship history, this is definitely a stop on your road trip that you should simply not try to miss. Next we come to Lexington, a town in central Virginia with about 7,000 people. A very beautiful town, fairly well preserved over the last 2 centuries, and not particularly overrun with traffic, so it's somewhat peaceful and quiet to walk around and look at the old houses and architecture and so on. However, more interesting than that is its historical pedigree, because it is home to both the Washington and Lee University and the VMI, the Virginia Military Institute, which can in some ways be almost described as the West Point of the South. Many famous American military officers have been studying here. Particularly, a lot of Civil War generals had its time at the Virginia Military Institute. Perhaps the most famous was Thomas Stonewall Jackson, who is lying buried at a cemetery not too far from the Institute. Many other notable military officers from the Civil War and later are also lying in this particular cemetery. So, if you are interested in actually looking up the final resting places of interesting historical characters, this is definitely a must that you must not cheat yourself out of. Generally, anyone with even a passing interest in the Civil War must make a stop in Lexington. Particularly because another very famous participant in the war spent his final years here. General Lee was president of the college after the war, and his old office, still actually stands as it was on the day of his death. He himself, with much of his family, is buried in the crypt under the church where his office is placed today, and his warhorse Traveller is buried right outside. Overall, the historical interesting parts of the town and the university and the military institute and the architecture of the town and just everything about it makes this a stop that anyone with either some time to spend on just walking around and looking at interesting places, or, as I said, with any kind of interest whatsoever about the American Civil War, must spend some time if they have a chance and a few days to spare. After Lexington, we stay in Virginia but move to the Natural Bridge, a natural stone bridge created by Cedar Creek eroding the softer stone below what is today the bridge's roof, so to say. According to a local sign, it was formed through 200,000 million years of erosion, and if there's no other reason to visit Virginia, you should definitely go there just to see this particular natural phenomenon that are apparently older than the rest of the universe, which is, of course, always an interesting sight to see. Despite this probably slightly overestimation in age, the bridge itself is really, really interesting, if nothing else than just due to size. 250 feet from the top to the valley floor you walk on, and wide and thick enough that US Highway 11 actually passes over the top of the bridge. In the evenings, there are also music and lights. We have, fortunately, though, managed to avoid this thing and just experience nature without human inventions improving upon it. During the Civil War, the bridge was used by soldiers who dropped heated and molten lead from the top of the bridge, and when it hit the water below, it has reached a ball shape and then sort of flash froze into bullets. So that was one way to make bullets during the Civil War era. Also worth noticing that in the mid 18th century, a young lieutenant named George Washington was in this particular area on an expedition, and if you look just under the bridge on the rock wall, a bit higher than a man can reach, someone has etched into the rock the initials GW. Now, I'm not saying anything, but yeah, I am basically saying that the first president of the United States might also, in fact, have been its first graffiti artist youth criminal. Feeling ready to move on from the bridge for a while, one takes a walk about a mile up the Cedar Creek Valley. There is interesting sights to see here as well. There is caves with a large population of bats, where guano used to be harvested in order to make gunpowder. There are small caves where a hidden underground river is flowing that took for almost ever to figure out where it came from and where it actually went. And when you finish this very scenic trip up the particular valley, you get to a small but very decorative waterfall that looks very pretty against the greenery and just the rock areas. Overall, whether your interest goes to geology or history or nature or youthful presidential misdemeanors, Natural Bridge is an area of Virginia that you should definitely not cheat yourself out of if you happen to be in those parts. Boone Hall Plantation in South Carolina near Charleston is one of the oldest working plantations left you can visit in the United States. If the building itself seems familiar to some of you, it might be because you're old enough to remember the television series North and South with Patrick Swayze from the late 80s, where this particular house was used to shoot the exterior scenes of Swayze's main family's mansion. Also, of course, is the famous Oak Avenue that leads from the main road up to the house. It was built by one of the first owners of the plantations, though he didn't live long to enjoy it since he fell off a horse, broke his neck, and died a very few years after it was planted. The plantation itself was founded in 1681 by John Boone, though the current main buildings are from 1934. It currently consists of about 300 acres of land, but it used to be almost 7,000 with areas all around the South Carolina area. You can see parts of the house. Beyond the slaves' huts are old smokestacks. There are buildings that were used for the work in the plantation in the old days. There is the old dock area on the local creek from where the plantation's produce was shipped off to Charleston for sale and further distribution. There is also an old and very interesting oak tree. It's considered the oldest oak in South Carolina, at least 600, perhaps even more than 650 years old. If you want to, you can take a small bus with a guided tour around the plantation. The guides are fairly knowledgeable and they will point out interesting places, as it is still a working plantation, though it no longer produces cotton. Nowadays it's mostly fruits and vegetables and Christmas trees, which seem to be a thing to grow nowadays. The tour itself is, of course, very interesting. You can even, with some luck, perhaps see a few alligators peeking up from the waterways. When you finish with that, you can go to the end to the private cemeteries for the earlier owners that was in the area. Again, returning to the television series, if you in fact have memories of that particular series or enjoyed it, you will truly really like walking around, as most scenes with the main family was shot in this particular plantation area, and there is a lot of scenes you will recognize or areas you will recognize from that television series. Overall, should you hold any interest in history or just plantation work in the Old South, this is certainly a very well maintained and very interesting place that you should not try to avoid if you are in the Charleston area. Charleston itself, of course, being a place I will most definitely return to in another video. And there we are. Another 5 areas for you to plan your road trips around. These are all, of course, in the east. We will be returning to the west and south next time on more videos about things to see. These were perhaps a bit more touristy than many I have done through this series. However, except for Natural Bridge during event areas, I have never been overrun with people in any of these places. So you can still basically go there and expect to see things without being mobbed by other tourists around you. But, well, I hope I have once again, or perhaps for the first time, inspired you to look at places to see when you take the road trip around America that everyone just must take at one point if they hold any interest in this magnificent land. Until next time, I have been the Sage, and I wish you all a very happy day.